All right, let's resume our meeting. We're heading into our information items, and our first item is the 2021-22 budget development process timeline and milestones.
Thanks, Tina. I'm going to hand it over to Bill Sutter, our CFO, who will be providing this presentation for you all this evening.
Great, thanks, Rob. So I will bring up this slide deck here. Make sure that's coming through okay?
Yep.
All right. So at this time in the budget development process, it's an update on the timeline for information and input and feedback and action items that happen. We've looked at this a couple of times already this fall. As in the last couple of years, we've started a little bit earlier than we had in the past. But so this will feel somewhat familiar to some people, but it really is an opportunity to get the word out to the public for the timeline associated with budget development. So this is the presentation that we call our timeline and milestones. And so it's a few slides that walks through the next few months of budget development. So really the process runs about 10 months for when we begin talking about the next fiscal year's budget. We're just barely into starting the fiscal year in September when we're already beginning to talk about the next fiscal year. So what this really shows is that there are lots of opportunities and a long period of time for stakeholder input regarding the development of the budget. So throughout this timeline, we have numerous meetings with employee groups and parent groups, ones that are regularly scheduled, ones that are ad hoc that come up. And so there's just a really long period of time and ample opportunities for folks to give input. Next, we layer on the Board of Education meetings and the work sessions that are scheduled throughout that timeline. There are a couple of months, namely December, as well as November and March, where there's only one official board meeting, but also often a work session. So what these are, board meetings, certainly there's the opportunity for public input. So anybody can sign up and provide their feedback on items regarding the budget. So again, not something that people need to wait for some particular time. There's numerous board meetings, so folks can sign up at any time. Next, we layer on what we call our data inputs. So these are items that are scheduled either sometimes by statute, sometimes by just the timing of when things happen, some information from the federal level. But these data inputs are spread across the whole time period of this budget development. So it's only towards the very end when we have a really complete picture of all the data. So at some point we have to make action or take action with incomplete data and have to move forward and react if things change. So again, these are items that are things like enrollment updates, the governor's budget, the current year revenue forecast by the state, that helps gives us information as to where the budget is looking at the state level in the coming year. And so each point along this way, we get a little bit more information and gets a clearer picture for us. What I want to point out here is just a couple of items that are coming up that will help really give us some information. They're really key points in the process. The December revenue forecast at the state, which is coming up either the end of next week or the first of the following week. It happens at around the 20th of the month. But that is the next picture from the state as to where the current year revenue is coming in and whether it's meeting projections as the state is going through its current year budget process. Then in February, we have the Consumer Price Index, which is the Denver, Aurora, Lakewood CPI. That is the number that drives what inflation is calculated against. And so that drives per pupil funding increases to the extent that the state has funding available. So that, again, is the federal information that's compiled and then released right around the 1st of February. And then our mid-year review of the district's finances to, again, give us a picture of where our expenses are happening in the current year and where we think we're going to end, and then roll into the next fiscal year. Next, we have our feedback loop. So these are board meetings and work sessions that are scheduled with a specific budget-related topic. So again, there are other work sessions and board meetings scheduled throughout this time, but these in particular are the ones that are specific to have an item specific to the budget. The next one being the one in January on the 19th. That's a specific scheduled work session on the budget. Next, we have our action items. So these are either driven by contract, by employee contract, or action by the board to adopt the budget for the next fiscal year. That deadline by June 30th is statutory. And then that sort of thin gray line there, the staffing allocation. So that action of distributing staffing really sets in motion the implementation of the budget for the next fiscal year. And so we have to get that information out so schools can plan schedules and staff classrooms and everything like that. And so when we start rolling that out between February and April, that's a big commitment of the budget that happens for the next year. So then we sort of pile all those on top of each other, and it really helps paint the picture that we're continuously getting information throughout the process. We're having feedback loops with the Board of Education, and then we're starting to take actions as we get into the spring for the next fiscal year. Next, I have a few updates on the budget development for the next year. So this is information since the last time we talked, the new information, the things that were kind of unknowns back in early October. So first, the governor released his budget. It's required that the governor releases his or her plan for the next fiscal year on November 1st. This year was certainly a little different in that there were a number of ballot items that had not been decided at the point that the governor had to release his budget. But what was rolled out that 1st of November and then updated right after the election is a restoration of major reductions. So there were a number of major reductions made to K-12, higher ed, numerous programs throughout the state, investments and services. And so the restoration of those major reductions was a key focus of the governor's budget. Economic stimulus. So there was a special session that just happened last week, and that was undertaken to spend some resources that were available rather than waiting for the legislative session to start in January and really get those dollars flowing out to individuals and businesses in the state. Saving for the future, so the governor does include putting some money away, those the dollars that are available that have already been collected. The end of last fiscal year for the state was better than anticipated. So putting some money into the reserves at the state level. And then the impacts of the ballot initiatives, it did increase about $105 million available for the state to spend. So those ballot items being the repeal of the Gallagher Amendment, which had a $300 million placeholder in the budget, and so that was able to be removed. There was also increases to the state education fund for the Proposition EE tobacco tax, and then revenue reductions for multiple years for Proposition 116, which is the income tax reduction. So there was some revenue increases as well as revenue reductions that were built into the governor's revised budget. Next, we have the more specific items relative to K-12. So it's a restoration, a complete restoration of the cuts that were made for the current fiscal year. So those reductions that were made puts that all back. It's about $811 million for K-12 schools. It increases the average per pupil funding by about $900. It does bring the budget stabilization factor back to where it was in 2019-20. So there's still a shortfall of funding of $572 million across the state for K-12 education. But this is certainly a big investment back into K-12 for next year. There are some concerns around this proposal for the sustainability beyond the 21-22 fiscal year with all the economic unknowns. And this is where those state revenue forecasts in December and March will really be an indicator of whether the state is on its economic recovery as is thought at this point in time. So what this proposal does for Boulder in particular is it does restore the funding that the district essentially backfilled with one-time resources for the current year. So while this sounds, it is extremely beneficial to the district, it really just puts in place the ongoing funding for what is currently being supported by one-time dollars. So I just want to be a little bit cautious that this does not mean that there will necessarily be lots of new dollars available to spend. So we did get that influx of CARES Act funds in the current year, which is really helping us support all the additional expenditures that we're having currently to run schools and run all the operations that we need to do. So this restoration of the funding is really just kind of putting that back in place. So again, just kind of want to point out that it's, we'll say, cautiously optimistic as to what next year looks like. So that's what I kind of just spoke to, the restoration of those one-time resources for us. So we currently have quite a bit of staffing on one-time resources that was built into the budget. And so those additional funds from the state, bringing those cuts back, would help support that into the future. The student count is certainly a concern. There'll be an update on that next. I think that's your next agenda item. We're down about 5% from where we were last year. We had projected a small decline when we built the budget originally of about 200 students, and that increased by about 1,400 students to 1,600 students overall. And so the idea of just how many students are going to return, is this likely a short-term dip? Liken it to an economic recovery. Is it a dip in the students and then a return to more consistent forecast with what we had been planning? And so again, looking forward to next year, any investments that the district will make will likely be focused on one-time dollars or repurposing existing ongoing resources. Another thing to note, that on the 4th, December 4th, there was a joint budget committee update. Craig Harper, who's the legislative staff who supports K-12 finance, talked about that statewide pupil count shortfall, and it's around 2 to 4% is kind of the number that most districts are seeing, and this is across the state. What that translates into is about $260 million in the current year budget at the state level that would be, could be redistributed. It either could be pulled back by the state or it could be redistributed out to districts. It could actually reduce the negative factor in the current year. And so that's one thing I think that is going to be looked at early in the legislative session when it starts in January. There is a bit of we'll call it a yo-yo effect or a yo-yo problem of the current year with a decline in students, this is a statewide impact, rapid decline, but then a rapid return of students when it's so difficult to project because all the typical enrollment patterns are not there, that planning for the future when we have to staff schools it just really creates a lot of challenges in building the budget. So to the extent that the state can help smooth the peaks and valleys off of the funding for districts will be very helpful as we're trying to bridge this kind of 2-year problem. And then also there was some discussion at that JBC update of House Bill 2014-18, which is the related to the mill levies and restoring districts back to where they were when they debruced, is what it's called. And the staff recommendation from Craig is that the General Assembly move forward with legislation that begins to phase out these property tax credits beginning next year. And so that's certainly a topic of discussion that'll come up. There's a desire to get a interrogatory to the state Supreme Court early in the session related to that, to make sure that it will be able to or won't be challenged or couldn't be challenged. And so they want to do that early in the session so that it doesn't hold things up towards the end. And Craig's point is that this legislation is really critical to improving equity in the state's property tax system and the sustainability of K-12 funding overall to really prevent the erosion of local support for K-12 education. So for next steps, again, as I mentioned a couple of times, the December state revenue forecast is coming up in another week or so. We'll have the state supplemental budget in January when the legislature convenes. back to that $260 million. That's significant restoration or really support districts all across the state if those dollars were able to come back into support the second half of the year. The CARES dollars that we received, they all had to be expended by December 30th. So it would really be supportive of K-12 into the second half of the year. Then we'll do our revised budget for the current year. That'll come forward to the board in January. And then, as I noted, the mid-year analysis, we'll bring that forward in February to really look at where we are, expenditure patterns in revenue collections going on in the current year. So that is the end of the presentation, and I'll certainly answer any questions.
Thanks so much. Can I ask a quick question on the timeline?
Mm-hmm.
How do the teacher union negotiations fit in terms of timing? And is the contract? I think the contract we signed goes into effect this calendar year. So where do we insert that in?
There are dates within the contract of when they would start. I believe it's February 1st, maybe is the date that's in the contract. Am I right on that, Mike?
That's correct.
Yep. And so we just have to have that negotiated and approved by the board by the time the budget's adopted for the next year.
Okay. So those are going to go into effect in parallel, correct?
Correct, for July 1.
Right. Okay. Thanks. All right. Richard, any questions?
No questions. Thanks, Bill.
All right. Kathy.
So I figure you'll let us know this, Bill, as we go along, but I'm wondering what student count you build your budget to for next year, because I don't think we're going to have those students come back second semester. So, and we might have the money from the state. So what is your thinking about how we build the budget on what numbers?
So the enrollment projection process, so we'll consider it a segregation of duties when it comes to enrollment projections because it is so tied into budget development. So Glenn Tegru, who's up next, is going to speak to the current year enrollment trends and where the students did or did not show up as expected, and sort of it hints as to what it will look like for next year. It is going to be extremely challenging, and so we will have to be very conservative and have backup plans as far as what staffing is going to look like into next year. But those enrollment projections aren't completed yet because we just completed the current year data, and we need that current year data to roll forward into the next year's projection.
And I just had a couple of questions because I know everybody's tired and it's been late. So I just want anybody who's still hanging in and listening to understand that if they take away the tax credits and we increase our mill levies, that's not going to mean more money for Boulder. What I'm hoping, though, is that it means that the money at least stays within education for the state. So that's just going to be a lobbying effort that we're going to need our lobbyists and you, Bill, and everybody to pay attention to, because that wasn't written into the legislation. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, absolutely. The concern that those dollars would be offset and support something else at the state level, the intent is clearly there that it will support K-12 education, but I don't think it's necessarily a requirement. So yes, definitely lots of legislative efforts to make sure that those dollars do flow into K-12.
And they would be our community's taxpayer dollars because they would be increasing our mills, but they're not meaning that Boulder gets more money. That's just the message I'm trying to get across.
Yep.
And the most it could go up for us is about 2 mills, 1.5 mills, 2 mills approximately.
Yeah, a hair under 2 mills.
Yeah. And then the other thing is I guess we'll just see as you go into the budget because it's getting late. You talked about repurposing dollars. There's a lot of uncertainty around whether even the money from the state is sustainable or long-term. So it sounds like we're going to be building a budget on a lot of one-time dollars. Is that fair?
So we have always considered School Finance Act resources to be ongoing dollars. Certainly the mechanism exists within the budget stabilization factor for it to go in one year and come out the following year. It requires exercising some caution on committing dollars long-term to things that can't be undone, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. It's not normal times, so we can't really, I think we just have to be more cautious on making those assumptions about whether they're long-term or sustainable dollars. But we'll see, we'll have a better sense later. So thanks, Bill.
Okay, Donna.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I don't have very many questions. I do get what Kathy's saying on the, we don't have a lot of mills to play around with, but with the 1,600 students that were lacking and what the Daily Camera reported and what, you reiterated tonight, that seems to me to translate into, with our MLOs and our state funding and everything else, into about $16 million. And I have this deja vu of, I think it was around 2008. I was still working in the district, but at that point when we had that recession hit and there were we were lacking in funds in the district, we had to implement a reduction in force kind of what do you call it? Not regulation, but act. And so everybody was kind of scrambling as far as, will I have a job or not? Do you foresee something like that, or is Glenn going to explain it more when he gets into the numbers?
I think Glenn's focus is more on the current year as opposed to the projection for next year. There's Glenn's peers in all the big districts around the metro area and across the state are certainly in communication, just like I am, with CFOs across the state to sort of come up with a reasonable, rational projection methodology that has never had to have been used before, right? So this is not something that that anybody has any experience with trying to project and the impacts of the vaccine. We've talked a lot about the vaccine effectiveness and timing and availability. All of those things will really play into what will happen next fall. So there's discussions of basically what percent of those students will come back. And so selecting that percentage that gets built into the model is the decision point that gets made. And then we just have to be able to react to it and have enough safety net to either react with more staff if the kids are coming in, or be able to backfill with reserves or one-time dollars fund balance in the event that students don't show up for that additional year.
Is that it, Donna? All right. Kitty?
I don't have any questions, thanks.
Okay, Lisa.
Me neither.
All right, Stacy.
No questions, thanks.
Kathy.
Just to follow up to Donna's point, if we had to take a hit like that, we'd get to use averaging, so we wouldn't really have to take it all in 1 year. Isn't that true?
Yes, the averaging is definitely coming in. For every district in the state that's declining will be benefit from the averaging formula that's built in there.
Okay.
All right. Well, with that, I think we can move on to our next item. Thanks so much, Bill.